Tonight, we begin with a major story that affects every American. The Supreme Court has issued a ruling that will reshape the landscape of gun laws across the nation. The U.S. Supreme Court has made a landmark decision on gun laws, fundamentally changing how all regulations are judged. This decision is expected to have far-reaching implications for both gun owners and lawmakers. In a 6-3 ruling, the court replaced decades of legal precedent with a much stricter test for evaluating gun laws. This new test will require courts to look at the historical context of the Second Amendment, rather than contemporary public safety concerns. This decision has sparked intense reactions nationwide, celebrated by gun rights advocates, condemned by those seeking stronger gun control. The ruling has ignited a firestorm of debate, with both sides gearing up for what promises to be a prolonged legal and political battle. For years, courts balanced public safety against the right to bear arms. This balancing act often led to nuanced decisions that took into account the complexities of modern society. That balancing act is now over. The new ruling shifts the focus entirely to historical interpretations, leaving little room for modern considerations. The new standard looks to history, not modern needs, to decide the fate of gun laws. This approach has raised questions about how relevant historical contexts are to today's issues. The ruling has immediate consequences, igniting legal battles and deepening divisions. Lawyers and activists on both sides are preparing for a wave of litigation that could take years to resolve. The core issue: how do we interpret a right written over 2 centuries ago in a world transformed by technology and violence? This question is at the heart of the ongoing debate. The Second Amendment's meaning is now being tested in a new way, with history as the judge. This historical lens could lead to the invalidation of many existing gun control measures. This decision doesn't end the debate. It opens a new, more complicated chapter. Communities across the country are bracing for the impact of this ruling. Gun owners fear for their rights. They worry that new regulations could infringe upon their ability to own and carry firearms. Others fear for public safety. They argue that more guns in public spaces could lead to increased violence and accidents. The Supreme Court's ruling didn't provide a simple answer, but handed down a complex legal puzzle. This puzzle will require careful navigation by lower courts and lawmakers. Lower courts, lawmakers, and citizens must now navigate this uncertain path. The legal landscape is more complex than ever, and the stakes are incredibly high. The debate over guns in America is more complicated than ever. With each side deeply entrenched in their views, finding common ground seems increasingly difficult. The only certainty: the conversation is far from over. As the nation grapples with this new legal framework, the debate will continue to evolve, shaping the future of gun laws in America. What did the Supreme Court actually decide in this landmark case? And how does it change the way courts evaluate gun laws in America? The court introduced what's called the History and Tradition Test, a new standard that now guides how judges must review Second Amendment cases. Under this test, for any modern gun law to survive, the government has to show that a similar regulation existed back in the 1700s or 1800s, when the Constitution and Bill of Rights were written and adopted. If there's no clear historical parallel, no evidence that lawmakers centuries ago passed a comparable law, then today's law is likely to be ruled unconstitutional, no matter how pressing the issue might seem now. This approach replaces the old balancing test, which allowed courts to weigh the government's interest in public safety against an individual's right to bear arms. Now, judges must act almost like historians, digging through centuries-old records, legal treatises, and historical practices to find evidence of past regulations that might justify today's laws. The focus has shifted away from what's reasonable or necessary in modern society, and instead zeroes in on what was accepted or practiced in America's early years. For example, if lawmakers want to ban a modern rifle, they must point to a historical ban on a similar weapon from the 18th or 19th century to justify it under this test. If no such historical precedent exists, the law could be struck down, even if it has broad public support or is intended to address urgent safety concerns. This dramatic shift has turned courtrooms into battlegrounds over the meaning and interpretation of history, with lawyers and judges debating the details of centuries-old laws. Ultimately, the legality of gun laws in America now depends less on present-day realities and more on the traditions and practices of the distant past. Supporters of the ruling see it as a vital protection of a fundamental right. They argue the Second Amendment deserves the same respect as free speech. The new test, they say, prevents judges from eroding gun rights based on personal views or shifting politics. By grounding decisions in history, the court ensures the right to bear arms remains strong and consistent nationwide. Supporters believe this brings clarity and predictability, ending the patchwork of conflicting state laws. They argue that if society wants new gun regulations, the Constitution, not the courts, should be amended. For them, the ruling is a promise that constitutional rights cannot be easily set aside. Critics argue the new test is unworkable and out of touch. Judges, they say, are forced to become historians, interpreting incomplete records from centuries ago. The weapons of today are far more powerful than those of the 1700s, making historical comparisons difficult. Opponents claim the test ignores modern realities and ties lawmakers' hands in addressing gun violence. They warn that the historical record is messy, leading to confusion and inconsistent rulings. Laws needed for today's challenges may lack historical precedent, making them vulnerable. The result: more legal uncertainty, not less. The rights of gun owners and public safety now hinge on how judges read the past. The Supreme Court's decision has unleashed a wave of lawsuits nationwide. Gun rights groups are challenging bans and restrictions, forcing courts to apply the new test. The results are unpredictable. One judge may strike down a law, another may uphold it. This has created a confusing patchwork of rules, with rights changing from state to state. Lawmakers and police are left uncertain about what laws are enforceable. The legal process is slower and more complicated, as states scramble to find historical support for their laws. The outcome of cases now depends on which judge hears them and how they interpret history. Instead of clarity, the ruling has brought more conflict and confusion. Recent cases in Illinois and Washington reveal the confusion and unpredictability that have followed the Supreme Court's new standard for gun laws. As states try to interpret and apply the ruling, the legal landscape has become a patchwork of conflicting decisions, leaving citizens and lawmakers alike searching for clarity. In Illinois, courts have upheld a sweeping ban on assault weapons, arguing that modern rifles are fundamentally different from the muskets known to the founders. Judges there say that because these firearms are more lethal and technologically advanced, the state has the authority to regulate them in the interest of public safety. The judges reasoned that some form of regulation has always existed in American history, and that states must be able to respond to new and evolving threats. They point to historical examples of weapon restrictions as evidence that the government can act to protect its citizens. Meanwhile, in Washington, the state Supreme Court upheld a ban on high-capacity magazines. The justices ruled that magazines are considered accessories, not arms themselves, and therefore do not fall under the direct protection of the Second Amendment. Gun owners and advocates, however, see this as a troubling legal loophole. They argue that magazines are essential components for the effective use of many firearms, and that restricting them undermines the right to self-defense. These cases highlight how courts across the country are interpreting the new rule in dramatically different ways, leading to a patchwork of laws and standards that vary from state to state. The result is mounting legal uncertainty and growing frustration on all sides, among gun owners, lawmakers, and the general public, who are left wondering what the law actually allows. Instead of bringing clarity, the history and tradition test has sparked a wave of creative legal arguments and new challenges, as both sides try to shape the future of gun regulation. For now, the debate remains heated and far from settled, with courts, lawmakers, and citizens all waiting to see what comes next. To understand today's debate, we must look at how the Second Amendment's meaning has evolved. For nearly 2 centuries, it was seen as tied to state militias, not individual gun ownership. That changed in 2008 with the Supreme Court's Heller decision, which recognized an individual right to own firearms for self-defense. Heller was a major victory for gun rights, but the court said the right wasn't absolute. Some regulations were still allowed. After Heller, courts used the balancing test to decide which laws were constitutional. Now, the new ruling replaces that with the stricter history and tradition standard. The meaning of the Second Amendment continues to evolve, shaped by the courts. the debate over its true scope is far from over. The Supreme Court's ruling has made the future of gun laws more unpredictable. Gun control advocates fear the new test will block common-sense measures needed to address gun violence. They argue that rights must be balanced with public safety, and that history shouldn't dictate today's laws. Gun rights groups, meanwhile, see the decision as a tool to roll back restrictions and protect their freedoms. Both sides are preparing for more legal battles, hoping for clarity from the court. The core question remains: how do we balance an 18th century right with 21st century realities? The Supreme Court has changed the rules, but not ended the debate. The future of gun rights and gun control will be decided case by case in America's courtrooms.